Mr. Edison, since the Great Train Robbery was not only your first picture, but the first real Western ever made, why don't we start with that film and have you tell us how you happened to be associated with Mr. Edison and how you made the Great Train Robbery with him?
Yeah, you mean from the initial appearance in pictures?
From your initial appearance,
yes.
And also from the first real Western, which was the Great Train
Well,
Robbery.
I was in New York trying to get a career in acting. Stage acting or vaudeville or anything like that. But I was not so successful. In fact, possibly I wasn't the actor they wanted. And I did a little posing for the different artists in New York in order to get eating money. So one day I stepped into a theatrical agent's office. His name was Ince, John Ince. Incidentally, he was the father of the Ince boys. And I asked him, is anything doing this morning? He says, no. He says, there's nothing of any importance doing. And I started out, and he said, oh, by the way, Anderson, would you work for peanuts? I said, no. He said, would you work for 50 cents an hour? I said, well, I'd work for peanuts right now. So he said, well, if you go down to the Edison Company, I think they're using some people posing in pictures. I said, well, I've never posed in pictures. He said, what kind of pictures are they making? Oh, he said, they're just making little 50-foot pictures, and they fireman, engine running down the street, or a kid playing an April Fool's joke, putting a high hat with a brick under it. A man comes along and kicks it. So I said, well, I'll go down. Where is it? He says, on West 21st Street. So I went down there, and I went in, and when I got into the studio, they were all sitting around having what they call now a coffee break. And so I looked very longingly at the coffee and the donuts, and Mr. Porter, who was the man in charge, he says, well, what do you want, son? I said, well, I do want a cup of coffee. He says, sure, if you're not allergic to donuts, have a couple. I didn't know what allergic meant, but I knew what donuts meant. So I went over and had a couple of donuts, and after that, they started their talking. And Porter says, well, he said, there's not much doing right now. In fact, it looks like it's the death of pictures. Of course, all the pictures they were making were for the mutoscopes, little 50-foot pictures and scenics and things like that. And he says that the theaters now are cutting them out. The theaters were running them, as what was known as chasers. When a picture come on and the audience start to get out, they wouldn't sit long enough to watch it. Maybe it wasn't worth watching anyway. So some fellow spoke up and says, well, don't you think that if we made story pictures? And I said, yes, I think that's a good idea, Porter. I said, why don't you make longer pictures? Give them something they can get their teeth into it, or amuse them, entertain them. He said, well, how long would you say? I said, well, about a reel or 800 feet. He said, well, that'll run about 10 minutes, wouldn't it? I said, I don't know, I guess it would. And then this other fellow said, you know, Porter, that I was in a play once, a sketch, rather, called A Great Train Robbery. And it went so well that they finally wrote it into a play, a 5-act play. And it went much better then. It was longer, it was more meaty, and the audience seemed to like it better. I said, see, Porter, that's it. Porter said, that sounds interesting. I'll take it up with the powers that be. So he said, you boys come back Tuesday. So we all came back Tuesday. And so he says, well,
you've gotten to the point about the 5-reel play. You've gotten to the point about the 5-act play, so yes. That's from there. Okay, Don?
Yeah.
Okay, Billy. If you can pick it up from the business about the 5-act play, The Great Train Robbery, and then take it on from there.
Yeah, when Porter told us to come back Tuesday. Yeah. The year this was, this was in 1903, see. And then Porter told us to come back Tuesday, he'll talk to the powers that be. There's a fellow named Waters and a fellow named White. So when we came back, he said, well, they weren't very receptive to it. They thought it would be too long and above all too expensive. So finally he said that we make out a scenario and bring it back, and they look it over. And Porter said, well, I don't quite know. Porter wasn't a producer, you know. He was the cameraman. So I said, well, a scenario, I guess they want scene by scene. Scene 1, scene 2, scene 3, scene 4. So then Porter said, yes, I'll write it out that way. So he did, and we came back the next day, and he said they agreed to let us make it if it doesn't cost over $700 or $800. So he said, I think we can get it in that. So then he started to cast it. Then he says, Anderson, do you ride? I says, ride? I says, well, I was born on a horse and raised in a saddle. He says, then you're a train robber. So Porter came up and he says, Anderson, I thought you said you could ride. I says, I can, but I wasn't. He said, I thought you were raised on a horse. I said, I was, but I wasn't raised on this horse. So he said, well, anyway, you were raised on a rocking horse. You better do all your train robbing from the foot. And that scene was for the gathering, so they run in and got the posse. And then while I was dancing, they run in and yell, been a train robbery, and they all run out. Then the chase started for the train robbery. And then the scenes were made. We made it all in 2 days. And then it was finished and cut and taken to the reviewing room. Then the train robbery, after it was reviewed, they all looked at it and they were all dubious about whether it would go or not. And Porter said, well, the only way we can find out is to try it out at a theater. So I think they tried it out first at the Eden Museum. It was on 14th Street here in New York. And then we all went down to see it. In fact, I did, I know. I went in and they were all seated there, and they came out and made an announcement. They're going to see something wonderful, a great train robbery. And the audience didn't seem to take to the idea very much. And it started. Then as it started, they all started to get boisterous and yell and shout, catch him, and all different kind of epithets, you know. And after the picture was over, they all stood up and cheered and shouted, run it again, run it again. So they did run it again, and they wanted to run it again. Finally, they turned on the lights, and they had to put them out. And then when they put them out, on the outside, there was a big gathering. They got wind of it, all ready to come in again. And I think they run it there for a couple of days. Then they run it up to get the reaction from a better class of audience. They run it up at Hammerstein's on 42nd and Broadway. That was a vaudeville house at that time. And I went over there to see it. And I was kind of a little dubious about how I was going to go to that audience. That was more of a sophisticated audience, you know, in a show-me type of audience. You know, around 42nd Street and Broadway, they got the same sort of habituous around there then as they got now. But that was all, as I say, a very sophisticated audience. And as the picture started, they all started to get up as usual and walk out, but turning back to look at it, you know, as it started to unwind. And then they all slowly, as the picture went on, went back to their seats. And then they sit there just stupefied. They didn't yell, but they were mystified at it. And then after it was over, they all, in one acclaim, gave it a rousing, rousing reception. And I said to myself then, that's it. It's going to be the picture business for me. The future has no end. It's going to build day by day. And of course, the future spoke for itself, which it did. And I dedicated myself then to the picture business. No more stage for me. No more posing. I was going to stick to the picture business until I got a foothold as high as I could go in it.
And the beginning of the Western film, too.
That's the beginning. Well, it wasn't exactly a Western film. It had the Western flavor, but it stuck in my mind as a picture of action.
Having worked with Porter, there's one question you may be able to clear up. Nobody's ever quite figured out why Edwin S. Porter made this Great Train Robbery in 1903, which is a wonderful little film for 1903, very well cut, very well put together. And yet from then on, he seemed to stand still. He made nothing else of any real importance. Even his later films with Mary Pickford were very static.
Well, I noticed what you said about making a Test of the Storm Country, produce that. Are you sure of that?
Oh, he directed that in 1915.
He made Test of the Storm Country.
And yet it was no more advanced than the Great
Well, who
Train
had he
Robbery.
made that for?
Lasky.
Huh?
Jesse Lasky.
For Biograph?
No, Jesse Lasky at Paramount.
Well, he might have. Yes, for Jesse Lasky, because I think he did connect with Jesse Lasky. That was after Mary Pickford had left the Biograph.
No.
The Biograph, I guess, had been extinct at that time, hadn't they?
Well, Griffith had left Biograph.
Huh?
Griffith had then left Biograph, and it was going downhill.
He left the Biograph.
In 1913.
Yeah, he left the Biograph. I didn't know that. And then Mary Pickford made the Test of the Storm Country for Jesse Lasky, and Porter directed it. Well, that's kind of news.
Was it your impression that Porter was just a mechanic, or was he interested in film, or just the mechanics of film?
Well, he was more a cameraman, more of a mechanical man. I didn't ever think he was cut out to be a producer, because I could notice him in producing even the Great Train Robbery. He had to get a lot of suggestions from me and from a fellow named Barnes. He wasn't a producer. That's why I was kind of surprised when you said he produced. And I guess he did. I didn't know. I didn't follow it up. I was busy making westerns at that time.
So what did you do after you left Edison? How long were you with Edison before you went to Buffalo?
Well, I stayed with Edison for a month or so, and then I made a few comedies for him. See, they didn't show any inclination to produce any more long pictures. They made little short pictures, 200, 250 feet, and I made a couple of them. Then I saw they weren't going to progress. They had lost Edison himself had lost interest in the production of the business. And then I went over to the Vitagraph people. And I talked to Smith over there about making pictures. They weren't making story pictures up to that time. They were making scenics and topicals and happenings. In fact, they were just then cutting the earthquake that they had gone out to San Francisco and made. And Smith said, well, we're busy now on this earthquake pictures. I said, what are you going to do after the earthquake picture? He said, well, I don't know. I said, what are you going to do, wait for another earthquake? And so he said, what do you want to do? I said, make a picture, like the Great Train Robbery, a real picture. He said, well, that sounds like a good idea. And he called in Stuart Blackton, who had more the theatrical knowledge and I thought than Smith. Smith was a magician, a prodigitator, as they call him. But Blackton was a cartoonist, and he had original ideas, you know. And he thought it was a good idea. And then they called in Rock. He was the businessman of the thing. And Rock says, yes, we'll make a picture. What do you think we should make? I said, well, why don't we make a picture called Raffles? I think at that time, Curl Bellew, he was an actor of note. He was playing Raffles on the stage. And I don't think it was public domain. And so I said, make a picture, one real picture called Raffles. It's going so well on the stage, and I knew a chap named Barney Sherry that would make an ideal Raffles. So we got Barney over there, and they looked at him, and they were well pleased with him. And so we made Raffles, 1,000 feet. We made it on the roof of the Martin building. And then I stayed with the Vitagraph people for quite a while, making pictures. I forgot what I made. And then I didn't seem to be advancing, only as a producer, director, and only making a paltry sum a week. So I thought I'd go elsewhere.
And that was to Selig, wasn't it?
Huh?
That was to Selig when you moved from Vitagraph.
To Selig?
Yes.
No. I went down to Pittsburgh. there was a couple of men there named John P. Harris and George Davis. They had a string of theaters, and I had the idea that they might make pictures for their theaters and make pictures for distribution. So I went down there and had a talk with Harris and Davis, and they liked the idea. And they said, yes, we'll make pictures. I think it's a very good idea. But what I found out afterward, all they wanted to make was subjects for their theaters. They had about 28 theaters, and they had about quite a few in Pittsburgh, Nickelodeons, you know. And all they wanted to do was make local pictures, local scenes, but they didn't want to make story pictures. Well, I didn't like that idea, and so I got up and I left them and I went to Chicago. And I went with Bill Seeley. I talked him into making pictures. He was had a projection machine called the polyscope, and that he was putting his time to that. But I talked him to making pictures, and I made a few pictures with Seeley there in Chicago. And then I talked Seeley into letting me go out west and he had a cameraman out in Denver where a lot of good scenery was, and I want to make some western pictures. So Bill said, all right, go ahead. And I went out and I met Buckwalter, and we went over to Golden, Colorado. And I figured on making a picture, a western picture. And I got an idea, wrote a very trivial story, and I looked around for somebody to play the lead, and I saw a young chap in Denver, I think it was in the park. He was playing baseball, and some fellow was batting him the baseball, and he was scooping him up very neatly and scooping up here. And I said, oh, he's a darn good ball player. He might make a good actor. So I went up to him and I asked him if he'd want to play a part in the pictures. I don't know anything about pictures. I said, well, I can teach you. So he agreed to play the lead in the picture. And his name was, after it's found out that he was a professional ball player. That's why he scooped him up so neatly. He was with the New York Yankees. He played third base for the New York Yankees. Well, anyway, I got together some more cowboys and how to use a couple of girls as cowboys. I couldn't get enough cowboys. We made a picture. Now, I made several pictures there in Golden. And then when I brought them back, and they were released, but they didn't go so well. And I thought there was something missing in them. And so when I got thinking, and I went to Seeley to make a few more pictures, and he didn't want to make any more. So I went over to a fellow named Spoor. He had the kinodrome. That was the opposition to the polyscope. And in Spoor's office, he had a lot of film that was all torn, you know, the sprocket frames were torn out. And he said, the work of the Seeley Polyscope Company. He was criticizing Seeley's polyscope. They were sort of deadly enemies. So anyway, I talked Spoor into forming a company. He said he'd put up $2,500. And we did. We made a company called the S&A Company. The S was for Spoor and the A was for Anderson. The S&A. So then we made pictures in Chicago, comedies, and I had a fellow named Ben Turpin.
This would be 1908, wouldn't it?
This was in about 1907. Mm-hmm. That was in 07 that the S&A was formed. And I made some comedies with Ben Turpin on the streets, and then we made some in the studio. It was in the back room, a big, large back room that Spoor kept his paraphernalia there. And we made the interiors there. And funny, right in the back of the studio was a city jail, and all the cells were there. And when we were making the pictures, all the prisoners came to the bars, and they started to shout and yell. We were making pictures, and finally the sheriff came over and asked us if we didn't make any more pictures there because it raised too much of a rumpus. We couldn't keep the prisoners quiet. So then we went out to Wells Street in Chicago, and we made a studio there. And then finally, I talked to Spoor to let me go out west and make pictures out there where the scenery was good and the climate was good and the daylight was sunlight. So he said, okay. So I took Ben Turpin and a fellow named Jesse Robbins as a cameraman and took Ben, and I went out to San Francisco first. That's why I intended settling. But it happened to be the rainy season, and it rained for about 2 weeks there, and it rained us out. So finally I heard about Los Angeles being ideal weather and ideal climate and the ideal atmospheric conditions to take pictures. I went down to Los Angeles, and I made the first picture in Los Angeles ever made in Los Angeles with Ben Turpin at the park called the Westlake Park. It was on 7th and Alvarado Street. And in this picture, it necessitated Ben being hungry, and he jumped in the lake there to get a duck to eat. And when he jumped out and started going to fry the duck, we had built a little bite. He was going to cook the duck. A cop came up, and he ran us all down to the police station for taking the pictures. And they told us not to take any more pictures in Los Angeles. It created too much of a disturbance. So then I went down to a little town called Whittier, tried to get down there, but they wouldn't let us take pictures there either on the street. So I came back to Los Angeles, and I talked him into letting me take exteriors there, and I'd take the exteriors along the street in Boyle Heights. That was on the east side of Los Angeles. So we built a little studio there in Boyle Heights and made pictures, made comedies. I didn't make any westerns there. I made comedies. And by the way, Hal Roach was working for me out there too, until finally he got the idea. So he said he's going to make his own comedies, and he left me, and he did. So then I thought that I would make westerns and get a studio to make westerns. And I looked all around Los Angeles to inspect the scenery, and I couldn't find the appropriate scenery for westerns, except I had to go too far, way out to Pahanga Canyon. And then I decided, I heard about Niles, California. That was about 30 miles from Oakland. And then I went up there and looked around Niles, and I looked at the scenery, and they gave me all the cooperation in the world, wanted me to come there. And I saw Niles Canyon, and I thought that was ideal scenery. So I decided to make the western pictures there. And then I hadn't decided myself on going in the pictures, but I decided on getting a lead. So I went around looking for a leading man. And there was an actor in playing the Virginian. And I asked him, I knew him, his name was Dustin Farnham. He was a very fine actor. And I asked him if he would come down and have a talk with me. He did. He came down to the studio and we talked over. He said, no, he said, I don't think that I care to go in pictures. He said, I don't think they'd last. I said, they're going to last longer than you're going to last as an actor, Dusty. He said, anyway, I'll pay out the Virginian. And he did. But incidentally, 2 years later, he made the Virginian for Cecil B. DeMille and also the Squaw Man. And by that time, well, anyway, so then I couldn't find anybody, and I decided, and then I remembered, back in New York when I was earning my living doing anything, I was posing for artists. And I posed for an artist named Christie, Howard Chandler Christie and Harrison Fisher, and a fellow named Leyendecker. And so one day, when I think it was Fisher, I was posing for him, and he said, Anderson, I think I'm going to make a picture of a cowboy. I think you'd make a good model for a cowboy. I said, what's a cowboy? So I don't know. He's a man that works on the ranch, or on the range. They don't have cows on ranches, do they? I think they have steers and They ride fences as far as I know. He said, I don't know anyway. You pose for it. And I said, I can pose for it. And so he dressed me up as a cowboy, and I posed for a cowboy. And after the pictures, then he said, you make a good cowboy. And I posed afterwards for Lion Digger for a cowboy, and he said the same thing for the cover of the Saturday Evening Post, a cowboy on the cover. So I remembered that he said, those artists said that I'd make a good cowboy. So I said, well, I'll pose for it. And then I read a story by an artist, a writer named Peter B. Kine, very fine writer at that time. And he wrote a story, and then incidentally, it was in the Saturday Evening Post. It was called, I think it was called Bronco Billy and the Baby, a very beautiful story. And his central character was this cowboy named Bronco Billy. And it was about Bronco Billy had robbed a bank in the town and had made his escape and got rid of the posse. And he lost the posse, and then he went back on his horse and started to ride on the road. And he came across a covered wagon. And as he passed this covered wagon, he looked up and he noticed a girl crying. And he said, that's a kind story, see. And he said to this girl, what's the matter, miss? You crying? He said, no. He said, then there are tears, aren't they? And she said, yes, my baby's sick in the back. And I said, well, why don't you drive to town? He said, well, I'm afraid I can't drive. And he said, well, I'll drive you back. So then this Bronco Billy gets in, and he drives this here wagon back to town, see, and he gives himself up. He takes the baby to the doctor, and of course then they arrest him and they put him in jail. And while he's in jail, this girl comes and talks to them through the bars. And I said to her, where's your husband, miss? As Bronco Billy did. And she says, well, he passed away on the trip. That's why I was alone. And then I said, would you marry again, miss? She says, yes. I said, would you marry me? And she said, yes. So then they had the wedding with Billy in jail and her on the outside. And I thought that was a beautiful story. And Kine wrote it. I didn't write it. But I pirated it and made it the first picture, Bronco Billy and the Baby. I even took the title. So one day, I saw a man standing in the studio looking, very intelligent-looking fellow. And I said, well, how are you? And he says, my name's Kine, Peter B. Kine. And I said, why, are you down here about that story? He says, oh, no. He says, that was all right. He says, I'm glad to see it in the picture. And he said, maybe I'll write for pictures again. I said, maybe you'll write me another story. Yeah, he said, I will, but I don't think you want to pay the price. I said, what do you write the story for? He says, $2,500. I said, nothing doing. He said, don't cost us only $700 or $800 to make the picture. He says, I thought so. He's a very nice fellow. He shook hands, and that's the last I saw of Peter B. Kine. And I don't know whether...
So few of those Bronco Billy westerns are still around today. It's very tough to generalize. Did you try to stress action more than plot, or did you try to establish a strong character in Bronco Billy and build stories around it?
No, I tried to make the premise as simple as possible and to characterize and dramatize the leading character. And I always wanted to do things that the public would like, even though he committed a robbery. See, I had him amend for it by doing something. Like he committed a robbery, and just to give a little idea of the stories, he committed a robbery, and he was caught, and the sheriff of the county where he committed the robbery come to get him. And he took the money away from me, and on riding back to his county, we stopped off at a saloon, a boarding house, and a dance hall, and he took me up to the room and handcuffed me to the bed. And he took the money with him back to the gambling room. So he went down there, and he got in Dutch. He started gambling, and he lost all the money. So when he come back,
You remember where you left off?
Hmm?
You remember where you left off?
Yeah.
Good.
Well, you can splice it, can't you?
Oh, sure.
Put it in. Yeah, but the sheriff came into the room, and after he had handcuffed me, and I was unable to get away, and he didn't have the bags of money. And I says, "Where's the money, Sheriff?" He says, "Downstairs. I lost it gambling." I says, "You lost it gambling?" He says, "Yeah." I says, "What are you going to do?" He says, "I'm going to take you back and put you in jail. Then I'm going to skip." I said, "No, you're not. You're going to take me back and put me in jail, but you don't have to skip." I says, "Would you let me have my gun and turn me loose? I'll go down and get the money." So he did. He unlocked the handcuffs, gave me the gun, and I went down in the gambling house and held him up, got the money, came back with the sheriff, said, "Let's beat it, Sheriff." And we went out onto the horses and away. So that's what I was just saying. That's the good Bronco Billy usually did.
Do you remember any players who appeared with you in those films who later became famous on their own?
Hmm?
Do you remember any particular players who appeared in those films with you, like Marguerite Clayton, who was the leading lady?
Yes.
Later became famous.
You mean any that got notoriety?
Well, not notoriety.
That are just appeared?
Popularity.
Huh? You mean became well known?
Well known through,
Yeah.
through the Anderson films.
Well, Margaret Clayton, I suppose. Well, there's a girl named Vita Burton. I don't think she gained any. But then there was a fellow named Brinsley Shaw. He went pretty good. Arthur Mackley, he went along pretty good. And then, of course, Wally Burry appeared in a few. He didn't get so far, Wally Burry. And then Charlie Chaplin appeared in a few. And in fact, Charlie directed one or two for me when I directed his picture out in the studio called The Knockout. Charlie returned the favor, and he said, "I want to direct a Western." So he directed one or two. He didn't like it. He didn't like the rough goings. But I think that's about all that gained any fame. Of course, Chaplin gained a little fame, and Ben got pretty high, and Wally Burry got pretty good, and Gloria Swanson went pretty far, although she never appeared in any Western pictures. She appeared in a few Eastern pictures, but she appeared through my solicitation. I saw her sitting in the studio once and asked the studio manager, "Who's that girl over there?" And he said, "Well, that's just a girl that your wife sent down here. She thought she was pretty." I said, "Well, she is pretty. She got personality. I said, why don't you use her?" He said, "We will someday." But she was the foster daughter of a woman named Mrs. Jones, who was the nurse for my daughter when she was a baby. And that's how Mrs. Anderson sent her over to the studio. But they didn't seem to want to use her. In fact, they couldn't discover talent. They didn't. I saw her, and I asked Francis Bushman if he'd use her in a picture, and he did. And that, from then on, Gloria Swanson became Gloria Swanson. That has nothing to do with Westerns, but it's just a little story about Gloria Swanson.
getting back to Westerns again, how did you get along with William S. Hart and Tom Mix? Did you meet them and did you discuss your work together?
I never met Mix, just casually, just shook hands with Mix. But I met Hart when I was down in Los Angeles negotiating for Charlie Chaplin. He was there playing the Squaw Man on the stage, and I had known him in New York, and I went and had a talk with him. And I said, Bill, I said, have you ever thought about pictures? He says, no, I haven't. I said, you'd make an ideal Western type. He said, well, maybe I will when I get through with this stage. I kind of like pictures. I know those Bronco Billies I saw, they kind of hit me. I said, don't do Bronco Billy. I said, you do Bill Hart. He said, well, I'll do my own characterization. And he did. He finally went in pictures. And he did a very, as you know, a very good characterization. In fact, I think Bill Hart was really the best of all, the silent fellows in the, well, I don't know how I would compare him with Arnaz and Clint Walker, but I think he was just as good as interpretation. Of course, he was a one character man. Everything he did was the same. He did that same somber face and did everything very well. In fact, the fact that he went on so well with the public proves that.
You also, when Hart and Mix, or at least when Hart was established, you then moved into features too, didn't you? You left the one-reelers and two-reelers and made some feature Western pictures?
I made some feature. Yeah, I did after Bill Hart got started. But he got too far advanced. When I came back, they were idolizing Bill Hart. And it was the start of a second beginning. And it didn't work out. The Westerns I made were good, but they weren't good enough to compete with Bill Hart's pictures. So I gave them up.
But you stayed in the film game.
Yeah,
didn't you produce some comedies with Stan Laurel at that time?
Yeah. I went to New York with Charlie Chaplin with the idea to make pictures with Charlie. I'd make Western pictures and he'd make those comedies. But Sid Chaplin, his brother, was pretty hard to get along with, and we couldn't cooperate, and so I gave up the idea. And then I went back to California, and I started making comedies, and I made them with Stan Laurel. And I made quite a few, and I released them through the Metro. Through Louis B. Mayer. Made them in Louis B. Mayer's studio. And he liked them. He wanted to become interested, and that's why I made the big mistake. He wanted to become interested in them because Louis Mayer always wanted the big piece of pie in anything he went into. And I thought I could do it alone, and I wasn't businessman enough. He was a great businessman. And after they were produced, I don't know, I drifted out of the pictures then. And that's really the story of my silent days in pictures.
Well, how do you feel about the Westerns today? Do you still follow them, or do you prefer to refer back to the old ones?
No, I like the Westerns today, and I think they're very well done, very well produced. And I think that the reason why they're so predominant, because they are the best entertainment on television. There's no doubt about that. And that's the reason why they're crowding out the dramas, those sordid dramas like they have, like Climax, Studio One, The Craft, and the Playhouse 90. They're so heavy, and so they're not understandable, really, by the viewers of the television. You know, the viewers of the television are, I wouldn't say the hoi polloi, but they're the type that eat corned beef and cabbage and boiled ham and things like that. They don't eat chicken under the glass and sirloin steaks. And that's who the Kraft pictures in the Studio One, the Climax, appeal to. And it's getting so now that they're losing them and they're going over to the Westerns because the Westerns are so simple. their plots are so simple, and their backgrounds are so great. They have scenic backgrounds, scenery. I even sitting and coming through the scenery on my trip to New York, I just sat there mystified by the scenery that I was passing through. And they have that in the Westerns. And that helps in the Westerns greatly, is their scenic background. And then the stories they have. They have simple stories, and they begin at the beginning, and they keep on their story to the end. They don't sidetrack like they do in Playhouse 90. They put sequences in the Playhouse 90 and the climaxes in the Studio One that have nothing whatsoever to do with the story. They have a lot of beautiful, great dialogue, well-written dialogue, but the people don't care about dialogue if they're not interested in the story, what the dialogue is about. And
especially when you can't understand.
Huh?
Especially when you can't understand the actors or mumbling lines.
Yeah, they overact. It's not the fault that they're very good actors, and they get too dramatic. While the Westerns, they keep the even tenor of the play. You know, if they say anything, they say, "I'm going to make you eat them words, mister." They don't say, "I'm going to make you eat them words, mister." They just say it in a convincing manner. And I don't think the dialogue that they have is convincing. And then they don't have any heart interest in those plays. I don't know. They have good writers. They're well written. And they're well acted. They call it good acting. But you couldn't do that kind of acting on Broadway in New York. You realize that yourself. But maybe they think that they're acting to people that's got to have that kind of acting. And the directors make them act that way. Well, anyway, that's I'm not a critic in any manner, shape, or form. But the critics are the people that see the shows on television, and they get more and more. They don't want to see those shows, and that's proven because they're taking them off. And when they take one off, they put on a Western, or they put on Milton Berle, because he really is funny. He's a good comedian. You've got to either make them laugh or make them cry. See, touch their heart or touch their physical being. And the Westerns does both. It touches their heart and it touches their physical. But it never bothers their mentality. There's no doubt about that. A kid 5 years old, 6 years old, and the mother, the father, and the grandpa, and the great-grandfather. He can sit there and understand what they're saying and understand what they mean. But you don't think a kid 10 years old could sit in front of a Studio One or a Climax or a craft play and know what it's all about. As soon as that comes on, he runs out in the yard. If he tries to turn on a Western and they won't let him, he runs out in the yard and has a fight or plays.
One. Okay. Well, Billy, those of us who remember the really great old Western stars, you, Bill Hart, Fred Thompson, Tom Mix, Buck Jones, Tim McCoy, and the others, Ken Maynard, we get a little depressed today. We look around and there just aren't any Western stars around. There are plenty of Westerns being made, but the stress seems to be on the Westerns themselves and not so much on the stars. Do you think this is a sign that Westerns are on the way out, or are they coming back stronger than ever, but in a different way?
On the way out? Well, I don't think they could find their way out. What I really believe about Westerns are going to continue and continue. Well, in other words, they're just going to be like Old Man River. They're just going to keep rolling and rolling along.
Oh, that's very encouraging. I wish they were rolling with people like you and Bill Hart, though, with a few less people from the Actors Studio. But I suppose one can't have everything. As long as they keep making them, that's the main thing, huh?
Yeah, that's the main thing. As long as they keep making Westerns, as long as people are born, they're going to have Westerns on the... if they cut out birth, then they can cut out Westerns.
Uh-huh.
They eventually die out. But they got to cut out birth first.
Well, I hope they do before they cut out Westerns.
Well, you
I
are?
guess that's it. That's wonderful, Billy, and thanks an awful lot.
Yeah.
It's been very valuable.
Okay.
Great.
I think you get some good material out of it.
Mr. Anderson, when you mentioned when you went with Mr. Spoor, he was at that time a projector manufacturer, and he was projecting the Kinodrome.
Well, he wasn't a manufacturer. When I left Seelig had the polyscope. You remember the polyscope?
Yes.
See. And then Seelig kind of give up the idea about making pictures. Seelig wasn't a very ambitious fellow. So I went over, I heard about Spoor, and I went over to see him. He had the opposition projector. He had the Kinodrome. And in his office, I noticed he had several strips of film with all the sprocket holes torn out. And he had a sign on it, done by the Seelig Polyscope Company. Not done by the Seelig Polyscope. Well, what Spoor's main business was, he had all the Kinodromes in the Orpheum theaters, see. And he furnished them the pictures, see, for the Orpheum Theater. That was his business, mainly. Then I talked him into forming the S&A Company. But about the Kinodrome, I think that the Bell and Howe were making the Kinodrome, weren't they?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
And they had a machine that was far superior. What he said was really true. They really had a
They had a much
that
better
was
machine
far
than
superior
Seelig.
to anyone else in the world at that
Seelig's
time.
machine did tear out the sprocket holes.
Yes, indeed.
There wasn't a time that an operator could go through a whole reel without having to stop and resplice.
Yes.
Resplice. But Spoor did have a good
that's
machine.
very true. I have both of those machines in my collection today.
Did you? Well, did you have
it's,
then the machine that came out that was better, as I remember, was a Simplex, wasn't it?
Yes, that was the one, and that was the one that
Porter claimed
that he designed.
Well, I don't know. Didn't Powers have something to do with that?
Yes, well, it was Nick Powers. Nick Powers was one of the early and most successful manufacturers of projectors.
Yeah.
And he went back to 1898. He tried to improve on the Edison machine, and practically all those machines looked very much, the design very much like the Edison. And as a matter of fact,
Edison had the basic principle, didn't he?
He had the basic principle, and his kinetoscope really inspired all these other fellows to go ahead and do something. As you said before, Edison, he sort of lost interest in it after a while.
Just like he lost interest in anything, just like you lose interest in a piece of pie after you've eaten it. See?
Yes.
After he's invented it and has proven his success, he don't care about the money is made on it or anything like that. Never cared anything about it, because I know in several of his talks, I attended a few of them, what they call, I suppose you know, the Motion Picture Patents Company.
Yes.
See? And Edison would give him a talk. And he always tried to strive to tell them not to try and corral the business, because you're never going to do it. Let the others come in. And all you do is develop with the others. But these patents companies like Smith, Blackton, Calum, Kennedy, Marion, and Long, and all those people, and Klein, they wanted it all for themselves. They thought that they could hold the moving picture business forever. And Edison told them, no, you can't do it. Let them expand. If they expand, you expand. What do you care if they make $10 as long as you make 15? But they never could get it through the heads of those people. And that's why they lost out. Then the Zuckers and the Laskys and the Fox and the Selznicks came in. And they had what it takes for progression. They had the business head.
Mr. Anderson, there's one thing I'd like you to do for me. I'd like you to look over at that board right here. Because when I was a little boy, I remember Bronco Billy Anderson, and I always remembered that Bronco Billy nose.
No, yeah.
And we haven't had a chance to see it. Look at the camera.
Get that nose,
but that
nose.
was always a handsome nose to me, and I'm sure to millions of other people. and we haven't shown it here.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Okay. Oh, you just want me to look over so we get a profile look.
Yeah, we ought to get a real close-up on
Yeah, I guess so. Let's go in this direction so we can get the
We go this way?
Billy, do you remember working at all at S&A with Henry B. Walpole?
What's that?
Remember working with Henry B. Walpole at S&A?
With Walpole?
Yes.
Well, I never worked in a picture with him, but I remember him working in pictures at the Chicago studio. I thought he was very, very clever.
Sounds like The Raven.
Hmm?
The Raven, wasn't that one he made for you?
Yeah, he made The Raven. Yeah, he made several very good pictures. Walpole, and Bushman was there.
That was
And I
named
forgot another fellow. I've forgotten his name. Another matinee idol.
Bryant Washburn. Bryant Washburn?
Yeah, Bryant Washburn. Yeah, that's the fellow. I forgot him. I forgot he married some actress we had. I forgot what her name was.
Well, the old S&A studio is still
Huh?
there. The old S&A studio is still there. They're using it for TV.
Yes, they're
TV
using it,
commercials now. They've got that wonderful old Indian head trademark.
Yeah,
Outdoor stuff.
yeah, whoever you call it, last night on the program, Betsy Palmer came up to me and she told me that she was working at the studio. She was doing commercials out there.
Uh-huh.
She said,
Did I get it done?
Get a profile? Yeah, we got that. I'm looking to do this back. Over in the middle.
A little bit more this way.
that way?
Yeah.